All right, listen up, because what I'm about to say ain't your usual sob story. This isn't about some saint or hero, dishki. Das. No, this is about a regular kid who got tired of being pushed around. My name? Nah, that's not important yet. What's important is where this story starts. In the same classroom day after day where I was the invisible kid. You know the type. Quiet, minding my business, keeping my head low. The kind of kid who people only notice when they're looking for someone to pick on. Yeah, that was me. Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't some pathetic weakling. I had my brains. That was my thing. Books, equations, numbers, that was my jam. But no one gave a damn about that. All the others saw was the kid who didn't fit the mold. The kid who didn't scream to be noticed. And when you're in high school, being quiet is just another reason to get picked on. Trust me, you could feel the eyes on you every single day, especially from the teachers. Let me give you a taste of what went down on a typical day. Mornings started with the usual bunch of loudmouths swaggering into class, acting like they owned the place, throwing jokes and insults like they were candy. I'd just sit there, scribbling away at the math problems they all thought were too hard for anyone who didn't want to hang with the cool kids. Honestly, I didn't care much. I wasn't there for friends, I was there for the damn numbers. But the rest of the world? Yeah, they had other plans for me. They didn't like that I didn't fit into their world. Take Mrs. Miller. Oh, this one was a piece of work. White, middle-aged, and full of herself. If there was one person who went out of her way to make me feel like I didn't belong, it was her. She had this way of acting like I was invisible, but not in a leave-me-alone way. No. It was more like I was a shadow, something to be used and discarded. And let me tell you, she loved putting me on the spot, always picking on me in front of the class, making sarcastic comments about how I didn't seem to get the concept. It was clear as day. She thought I was just another dumb kid who didn't deserve to be there. But I wasn't like the others. I wasn't loud or rude trying to prove something. I had a different kind of power, one that came from understanding things other people couldn't. Math, physics, whatever it was, I could solve it. But no one ever saw it. They saw the kid who was quiet and kept his head down. They didn't know the late nights I spent in my room, working through impossible equations, cracking codes that no one else could even begin to understand. And so there I was one morning minding my own business when Mrs. Miller decided it was time for me to step up. She called me to the board like she was doing me a favor. "Darius," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "come show us what you've got. Solve this." She slapped some ridiculous equation on the board, the kind of stuff most kids would break a sweat over. The class went quiet. Everyone knew what was happening. This was going to be the moment where I'd either sink or swim, where she could throw me under the bus and let the whole class laugh. I felt the blood rush to my face. Nerves, right? Who wouldn't be nervous? But I wasn't stupid. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me struggle. So I walked up to that board like I was the king of the world. I stared at that equation like it was nothing. And then I just went to work. You could feel the room shift, the murmurs, the whispers, the eyes boring into me. I could almost hear their thoughts. There's no way this kid can do this. But I could. And I did. I solved it, just like that. And you know what? Mrs. Miller, the so-called expert, stood there frozen, looking at me like I'd just slapped her across the face. There was no smirk, no snarky comment. She didn't know how to react. And the class? They didn't know what to do either. Some were staring wide-eyed like they'd just seen a ghost. Others started to mumble like they were suddenly trying to piece together what had just happened. Yeah, they were shocked. But here's where it gets good. Mrs. Miller? She wasn't about to let me have my moment. She wasn't about to let some quiet kid show her up. So she threw another problem my way. "Okay, Darius, let's see you handle this one." She had this smug look on her face like she was sure I'd crack under pressure. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. It was like she was trying to break me, like she couldn't accept that I was more than just some quiet kid who kept to himself. But the more she threw at me, the more I nailed it. The more I nailed it, the angrier she got. Her face started turning red, like she was getting all flustered. Meanwhile, the rest of the class started looking at me with a mix of awe and confusion. This wasn't supposed to happen. This kid wasn't supposed to be good at math. This kid wasn't supposed to be the one who showed them up, but I was. And by the time I was done, I could see it in their eyes. They had to admit it. I wasn't just some quiet kid. I was fucking good at what I did. But let me tell you, Mrs. Miller, she wasn't done with me yet. Oh no, she had one last trick up her sleeve. But me? I was ready. I wasn't backing down, not this time. So here's the deal. Mrs. Miller wasn't having it. She wasn't about to let some quiet kid like me walk away looking like a genius in front of the entire class. You know the type, right? The ones who can't stand the idea of someone else getting a win, especially when they're not ready to admit they've been outdone. Yeah, that was her. And I was that kid who was now making her look bad. You could see it in her face, the disbelief, the irritation. She was so sure I was going to mess up. She probably had a whole speech planned in her head about how I'd fail, just like she thought I would. But guess what? I didn't. And when I turned around with that chalk in my hand showing the whole damn class I had nailed it, there was no denying it anymore. The whispers, the shocked glances, the way some kids looked like they had just seen a ghost. Yeah, that felt damn good. But here's the kicker. Mrs. Miller wasn't about to let me have my moment. No way. She wasn't going to let some quiet kid steal the spotlight, not on her watch. I could see it in her eyes. She was pissed. So what does she do? She throws another equation up on the board, a harder one. But let me tell you, the harder it got, the more I felt the challenge. She thought I was going to crack? Nah. This wasn't even my final form. She didn't say it, but you could tell by the way she looked at me. She wanted me to fail. I was getting under her skin, and that was exactly what I wanted. So I took that new equation, stepped up to the board again, and started working it out like I was just sketching a doodle. I could feel the class looking at me, waiting for me to mess up, waiting for me to give her the chance to tear me down in front of everyone. But nah, that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't that kid anymore. I wasn't just the quiet one in the back who took shit from everyone. I was the guy who was going to show her exactly what I was made of. As I worked through the problem, I could see her sweating it. Her face was turning this shade of red, like she was trying to hold back some kind of rage. The longer I took to solve it, the angrier she got. And honestly, it was kind of hilarious. Here she was, this teacher expecting me to choke, and I was making her look like an amateur. I could hear a few of the jocks in the back whispering to each other, like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. "No way he's pulling this off," one of them said. But I didn't care. They could talk all they wanted. I had already figured out the answer in my head before I even touched the chalk. So I finished solving the damn thing, turn around slowly, and there she is, just standing there, frozen. She had nothing to say. She was so flustered, so damn rattled, she couldn't even look me in the eye. And let me tell you, that moment was priceless. The class was dead silent. I could feel everyone holding their breath, like they were waiting for the punchline of some sick joke. But there wasn't one. There was just me, standing there like a boss, while she stood there trying to piece together how the hell a quiet kid like me had just schooled her in front of the whole class. But she wasn't done. Nope. She had to have the last word, right? So she throws up one more problem, a bigger one, a bad one, and I'm like, "You think I'm going to fall for this? Not today, lady." She's standing there, all smug, like she's got me cornered. But guess what? I didn't back down. I stepped up to that board like it was the easiest thing in the world, and I started solving it without breaking a sweat. I could feel the whole damn room watching me now. It was like I was the main event, the show everyone had been waiting for. But Mrs. Miller? She was losing it. You could tell she wanted to pull her hair out. And guess what? That felt so damn good. When I finished, I didn't look for a reaction. I didn't care if she said anything. I didn't need her approval. I just turned around, took one last look at her face. And I could tell deep down she knew what was coming next. The class? They couldn't believe it. They were still processing what had just happened, but I was done. I didn't need to explain anything to them. I didn't need them to understand. I just needed to show them who the real boss was. And when I walked out of that classroom, all I could feel was that sweet, sweet sense of victory. Because Mrs. Miller? She wasn't the boss anymore. I was. You think Mrs. Miller was going to let it slide after I made her look like a fool? Nah, she wasn't that easy. As soon as she walked into class the next day, I could feel the heat coming off her. She wasn't just pissed. She was furious. You could see it in her eyes, that fire burning like she was on a mission to get me back. But I wasn't some weak kid anymore. Oh no, not this time. She didn't even waste a second. No good morning or pleasantries. She just went straight for the kill. Walked up to the board, picked up the chalk, and without even looking at me, scribbled a monster equation on the board, like she was trying to catch me off guard. It wasn't even the math that got me. It was the way she was looking at me, like she was daring me to mess up, like she was going to prove I wasn't good enough for the spotlight. But I wasn't scared. Hell, I was almost amused. Mrs. Miller had no idea what she was in for. She thought she had all the power in that room, but not anymore. It was my turn. So I stood up, grabbed my seat, and walked to the board like I was walking onto a stage. The class was dead silent, every single one of them watching, waiting for me to trip over my own feet. They didn't think I could pull it off twice. "There's no way this kid's getting this one," I heard a voice whisper from the back. Oh, I heard them all right. But none of that mattered now. Mrs. Miller was still standing there, arms crossed, with that cocky little grin on her face. She probably thought I was going to fail miserably. She thought that maybe if I stumbled just once, it would be the moment she could rip me apart, show everyone that I wasn't what they thought I was. She didn't know who she was dealing with. I stared at that equation, a mess of numbers and variables that would have broken anyone else. But for me, it was just another puzzle to solve. With every step I took, every number I plugged in, I could feel the tension building. The room was dead quiet, not even a breath. It was like the entire class knew that if I cracked, they could laugh about it for weeks, but I wasn't cracking. I was in control now. Every number on that board, every calculation just flowed. It felt like second nature. As I worked through the problem, I could see Mrs. Miller trying to keep her cool, but the sweat was starting to bead on her forehead. She was getting nervous. And me, I was loving it. And when I solved the damn thing, I turned around, put the chalk down, and gave her a look. Not a smile, not a taunt, just a look. The kind of look that said, "You thought I was going to fail? Not today." The room was still. Every single person was staring at me. Mrs. Miller? She looked like someone slapped her in the face. She couldn't say a word. But of course, she wasn't going to let me walk out of there like I owned the place. She had one more trick up her sleeve. She wasn't ready to give up. So she grabbed the chalk again, threw a new problem on the board. And this time, she made it personal. "You really think you can solve this one, Darius?" she asked, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she always used when she was trying to hide her anger. "Let's see what you're made of." She wasn't asking for my best. She was hoping I'd mess up. She was hoping I'd crack under the pressure. But I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. I walked up to the board again, not a single doubt in my mind. This was it, the moment to show her just how wrong she was. The class was on the edge of their seats now. They knew something big was happening. I could feel their eyes on me like I was some kind of show, but I didn't care. I was here to prove something, not to entertain. I grabbed the chalk, turned to the board, and started working it out. I could feel the energy in the room shift. People were leaning forward. They were all watching, waiting to see if I would fail. But guess what? I didn't fail. I nailed it. Step by step, I worked through the problem with ease. By the time I finished, I turned around and saw her face. Mrs. Miller was standing there, frozen, her mouth open like she had just seen a ghost. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. She was beat. The class? Dead silent. They didn't know what to do. But me? I was already done. I didn't need to hear anyone say anything. I didn't need any applause. The victory was in the silence. I had just outsmarted her again, and this time there was no way she could argue with that. And as I walked out of that class, I knew something had changed. Not just in the way the others looked at me, but in the way I looked at myself. I wasn't the kid who sat in the back anymore. I wasn't just the quiet one. I was the one who owned that room. And Mrs. Miller? Well, she was just the teacher who'd been outsmarted by the kid she'd never thought would be anything more than invisible. By now, everyone knew what was up. Mrs. Miller had already tried everything she could to knock me down, but nothing worked. She had been beaten. Not by some grand speech or show, but by raw skill and confidence. And the best part? She couldn't do a damn thing about it. That afternoon, though, something changed. The whole class had seen what I could do. Mrs. Miller had tried her best to maintain control, but she was done. You could see it in her eyes. She was defeated. She never expected a quiet kid. A kid she'd mocked and underestimated to end up schooling her in front of everyone. And the thing is, I didn't even need to say anything. I didn't need to rub it in her face. I didn't need to throw her mistakes back at her. I just walked out, head held high, and knew I didn't have to take shit from anyone anymore. By the end of the day, the whispers from the kids in the hall were different. They weren't laughing at me anymore. They were talking about how I had shut down Mrs. Miller in front of the whole school. They were respecting me. But Mrs. Miller? Well, she was left standing there in the classroom, probably trying to figure out how in the hell she got beat by the kid she thought was nothing. It was her lesson to learn, not mine. And I walked out of that room knowing I wasn't just the smartest kid in that class. I was the one they couldn't forget.